The soft glow of the table lamp stretched long shadows across the quiet living room, where James sat unmoving, his gaze locked on the sealed envelope in his hands. The envelope, deceptively simple in appearance, carried an unbearable weight, now the singular focus of his life. His trembling fingers brushed along its edges, as if stalling the inevitable, hesitating under the crushing burden of what he was about to uncover. This wasn't just paper, it was an answer to the relentless questions that had tormented him for months. Taking a sharp breath, he tore it open, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Inside, the folded letter seemed frail, almost like it could crumble, just like the fragile threads of his world. His eyes scanned the words, and in a single, gut-wrenching moment, his life unraveled. None of the children are biologically related to you. The words, so cold and clinical, struck with the force of a wrecking ball. He read them again, his mind frozen in disbelief as the room seemed to collapse around him. His chest tightened, the weight of the revelation pressing on him like a vice. Outside, the world remained oblivious, filled with its own noises and routines, while inside him a storm raged. Memories assaulted him, vivid and painful. His daughter's first steps, his son's triumphant smile after a soccer game, the laughter that had once filled the dinner table. All these moments, once the very fabric of his happiness, now felt distant and false. The letter in his trembling hand, undeniable and stark, marked the shattering of every belief he had about his family, his wife, and his life. James sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing yet his body paralyzed. The betrayal was too vast, too incomprehensible to process. Finally, with a shaky resolve, he stood, gripping the letter tightly as he moved toward the window. The winter air seeped through the cracks, biting against his skin, the city lights beyond seeming like distant stars in an unreachable sky. He stared blankly, his thoughts swirling in a vortex of rage, confusion, and despair. As he turned back to the room, his gaze caught the family photographs on the wall, pictures of laughter, milestones, and joy. They mocked him now, each one a reminder of the life he thought he had built. He needed air. He needed to escape. With heavy steps, James moved to the door. Each motion felt mechanical, as though his body were on autopilot. The door creaked open, letting the frigid night air wash over him, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of his grief. Without a second glance at the house that had once been his sanctuary, he stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind him with an echo of finality. This is it, he thought, as the words from the letter burned into his mind. Everything is over. Nothing will ever be the same again. The thought lingered at the back of James's mind, gnawing at him as he drove to the office. Was Rebecca putting on a facade of normalcy for his sake? The uneasy feeling that something wasn't right refused to fade. In the weeks that followed, James tried to ignore the widening cracks in the seemingly perfect life they had built together. Rebecca's long hours at work became more frequent. She would leave early in the morning and return late at night, her tired eyes betraying a burden she wouldn't share. It wasn't just exhaustion from work, it was something else entirely. She grew distant, retreating into her own world, often lost in thought. Her phone became an extension of her hand, a device she clung to with a newfound secrecy, disappearing into the bathroom for extended stretches. At first, James told himself it was the stress of her new promotion. The demands of her role, the increased responsibilities, surely these were to blame. But then, the smaller details began to surface, each one gnawing at his sense of security. The way her voice cracked during mundane conversations, the hollow moments of silence between them, where neither could find the words to bridge the growing distance. One evening, as James sat on the couch after dinner, he watched Rebecca in the kitchen as she prepared to go out with friends. She was dressed up, something she hadn't done in a long time, and for a fleeting moment, James was transported back to the early days of their marriage. He remembered the way she used to dress just for him, the way she'd seek his opinion on her outfits with a playful grin. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Rebecca looked up, startled by the question, and quickly forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just need a night out. It's been crazy with work," but her smile didn't reach her eyes, and the way her hands fumbled with her earrings revealed her unease. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The late nights at the office, the unexplained absences, the emotional distance, all of it painted a picture he didn't want to see. But as quickly as the thought entered his mind, he pushed it aside. He loved her. He trusted her. That's what he kept telling himself, even as doubt loomed larger with each passing day. The next morning, Rebecca left for work before the children were awake. James kissed her goodbye, but the moment felt cold, mechanical. She didn't look back as she walked out the door, and the silence that filled the house after her departure was suffocating. Later that afternoon, as James sat in his office, the email from the DNA testing lab arrived. His heart raced as he opened it, this time with no hesitation. "None of the children are biologically related to you." The words leapt off the screen, echoing in his mind. It wasn't just Rebecca he had to question, now it was everything. The perfect life he thought he had built was a lie, and the cracks that had started small had now split his world apart. That evening, as the house fell into an eerie stillness and the children were tucked into bed, James found himself alone at the kitchen counter. Rebecca had vanished into the office for yet another late-night work session. His gaze fell on the stack of bills in the corner, his mind preoccupied with the test results. Flipping through the pages absent-mindedly, his eyes landed on the phone bill, and something about it caught his attention. A number repeated over and over. Late-night calls, 10 in the past week, all to the same number. The discomfort settled in his chest as his fingers hovered over his phone. He dialed the number, his heart pounding as the call rang through to voicemail. For a moment he considered letting it go. He had no evidence, no reason to jump to conclusions. But the doubt, that persistent shadow, refused to leave. Rebecca's growing secrecy, her late nights, her guarded demeanor, all pointed to something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. Just as he set his phone down, his eyes landed on Rebecca's phone, left behind on the counter. A notification lit up the screen. Without thinking, James picked it up. The text was from someone named Mark. The name felt familiar, yet he couldn't place it. His thumb hovered over the screen as curiosity and dread pulled him in. The message read, "Can't wait for tonight. I'll make sure we're not disturbed this time. Just you and me, like before." James felt his stomach drop, the tone of the message intimate, full of familiarity and flirtation. This wasn't work-related. This wasn't innocent. His pulse raced as anger and confusion swirled within him. The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, each one cutting deeper than the last. Rebecca's late nights, her secrecy, the cold distance between them, it was all leading to this. As he set the phone back down, James's thoughts spiraled out of control. How long had this been going on? Who was Mark? Every little doubt he'd dismissed, every moment of unease, now surged forward with undeniable clarity. It was no longer just suspicion, it was truth, and it was devastating. When Rebecca finally walked through the door, James was already waiting for her in the living room. The silence between them was heavy, oppressive, and devoid of the warmth that had once defined their relationship. There was no cheerful greeting, no kiss, no smile, just an emptiness that lingered in the air. "Hey," Rebecca said, her voice unnaturally cheerful, as though trying to pretend nothing had changed. But James wasn't fooled. He stood slowly, his gaze fixed and unwavering. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice steady but laced with tension. Rebecca's eyes darted nervously, and she tried to mask her discomfort with a forced laugh. "What's up?" she asked lightly, though her tone betrayed her unease. James reached into his pocket and pulled out her phone, the weight of the silence between them now unbearable. "Who's Mark?" he asked, his voice sharp and direct. For a brief moment, her face faltered, her composure cracking, before she quickly recovered. But James had already seen enough. "You've been texting him," he continued, his voice still calm, but with a growing edge. "A lot. Don't lie to me, I saw the messages." Rebecca's smile disappeared, and she suddenly looked smaller, almost fragile, as she stood before him. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor before meeting his again. "James, please," she began, her voice shaky. "It's not what you think, it's just work. Mark's a colleague. He's been helping me with some projects." James shook his head, his patience unraveling. Her lies, once carefully constructed, were now transparent. The facade she had maintained for so long was crumbling before his eyes. "Rebecca, don't lie to me," he said firmly. "This isn't work. You don't text someone like that if it's just about work. I want the truth." Rebecca exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her deception had finally become too much to carry. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked away. "It's not just work, but it's complicated. I don't know how it happened, but we've been seeing each other for a while now." The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the weight of her words. James didn't move, his body frozen in place as his mind struggled to process the revelation. Rebecca glanced up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, James. I never wanted you to find out like this. I never meant to hurt you." James stared at her, a storm of disbelief and heartbreak etched across his face. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" Rebecca hesitated before answering quietly. "Almost a year. It started innocently enough, but I don't know. It got out of control. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear." Her words, though pleading, meant nothing to James anymore. The damage was done, and there was no going back. "I didn't want to hurt you," echoed hollowly in his mind, a meaningless refrain in the face of her betrayal. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of everything he had just learned pressing down on him. His heart ached, but amid the pain, a strange clarity began to emerge. "This is over," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with finality. "Do you still love me?" The question hung in the air, fragile yet heavy. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. Her silence was all the confirmation James needed. In that moment, everything they had built, the life, the memories, the promises, crumbled into nothingness. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. James had always believed he knew Rebecca better than anyone, her habits, her moods, her every glance. But now, standing across from her, he felt like he was looking at a stranger. The woman he had married, the woman who had vowed to stand by his side forever, was someone he no longer recognized. As his heart pounded with the weight of the betrayal, James knew one thing with absolute certainty: he couldn't let this go. He needed answers, more than Rebecca's hollow confessions. The lies stretched deeper than he had imagined, and the reality was far worse than he had feared. As James scrolled through the images, each one felt like a fresh wound, a betrayal that cut deeper than he ever thought possible. Yet the most devastating blow came with the arrival of the DNA test results in the mail. Weeks earlier, before the full weight of suspicion had overtaken him, he had arranged for the test, driven by faint whispers of doubt he could no longer suppress. When the envelope finally arrived, he hesitated, already knowing what it would reveal. Still, the confirmation hit him like a cold wave. He tore the envelope open, his hands trembling, almost too afraid to read the truth but powerless to stop himself. The words leapt from the page: "None of the children are biologically related to you." James staggered backward, his knees weak, gripping the kitchen counter to steady himself. The world spun around him, the room suddenly too small, too suffocating. He had known, deep down, but seeing the truth spelled out in stark black and white was more than he could bear. His children, the ones he had nurtured, loved, and poured his heart into, were not his. They were strangers, someone else's flesh and blood. The realization struck him like a physical blow, robbing him of breath. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore, it was biological, cutting to the very core of his identity. Rebecca, the woman he had loved, had deceived him not once, but repeatedly for years. How could she do this? How could she take so much from him? James stood there, paralyzed, the results burning in his hands like a physical manifestation of the life he thought he knew, now reduced to ashes. Time seemed to stand still as the weight of his discovery pressed down on him. The tension between him and Rebecca had reached an unbearable peak. Every conversation now a hollow performance, both of them playing roles they no longer believed in. Rebecca's apologies were empty, mere words that couldn't erase the truth. Days passed in a haze, James finding it increasingly impossible to stay in the house. He couldn't look at Rebecca without seeing the lies in her eyes, nor could he face the children without feeling like an outsider in his own home. Every corner of the house, every shared memory, was tainted by deception. Rebecca tried to make amends, but James couldn't bring himself to care anymore. She wasn't the woman he had trusted, the mother of his children. She was a stranger who had shattered everything they had built together. Finally, James made the decision he had been avoiding. He couldn't stay in a house filled with ghosts of the past, echoes of betrayal that refused to be silenced. He couldn't stay for the sake of the children. Either they deserved the truth, not a father broken by the lies of someone he had trusted the most. As he packed his belongings, a deep, aching sense of loss washed over him. The life he had fought so hard to protect was gone, nothing more than a bittersweet memory, now overshadowed by the undeniable reality that it had all been a lie. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the empty house like the final toll of a bell. As he walked away, the weight of betrayal and the life he had left behind pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. Nothing would ever be the same. The truth had settled in his chest like a leaden anchor, suffocating and inescapable. Standing in the house that had once been his sanctuary, James's pulse quickened with a fury that had been building for days. Every inch of this home had become a symbol of Rebecca's lies, a testament to the woman who had once been his everything but was now reduced to a stranger. Rebecca stood across from him, her pale face streaked with the remnants of tears. But her apologies, her attempts at explanations, no longer mattered. "I know about the test," James said, his voice steady but razor sharp, his eyes burning with an emotion that defied description. "I know the kids aren't mine. I know about Mark. And I want to know why. Why did you lie to me for so long?" Rebecca opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Guilt flickered across her face as she looked down, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. "I never meant to hurt you, James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never planned for this to happen. It just did." She reached out to him, but James recoiled. "Don't," he said sharply, his words cutting like glass. "You've hurt me more than you'll ever understand. You destroyed our family. Everything I thought we had was a lie." The room seemed to freeze as the truth hung heavy between them. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but James could no longer see the woman he had once loved. She was a stranger now, the architect of his heartbreak, and nothing she could say would undo the damage. "I thought we had something real," James said, his voice breaking under the weight of the words. "I gave you my heart, my trust, and you took it all. You took everything." The room felt colder as his voice trailed off, the silence between them thick and suffocating. His anger was no longer a fleeting emotion. It had become a fire, raging uncontrollably, consuming every corner of his being. His body trembled, not from fear or regret, but from the crushing realization of betrayal, the heartbreak, the loss, and the irreparable damage to the life they had built together. Rebecca's eyes brimmed with tears as she instinctively stepped back, murmuring, "I'm so sorry." Her voice was barely audible, hollow and devoid of meaning. The apology, though spoken, carried no weight. It was just words, empty syllables that could never undo the devastation. James took a deep, shuddering breath in an attempt to steady himself, his hands clenched into tight fists as the storm of emotions within him threatened to spill over. He could hardly bring himself to meet her gaze. The thought of the children, the ones who had called him Dad, the ones he had raised and loved as his own stabbed at his heart like a knife. A pang of sorrow struck deep in his chest. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Rebecca," he said, his words trembling but firm. "You lied to me for years. You made me believe I was raising a family, my family, and now I find out it was all a lie." His voice cracked on the last word, his vulnerability laid bare. Rebecca crumpled into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. "I never wanted this," she cried, her voice muffled. "I never wanted it to end like this. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to tell you I was lost, James. I felt like I was disappearing." James stood motionless, his gaze fixed on her as his heart shattered anew. "Lost?" he repeated, the word bitter in his mouth. "What about me? What about the years I gave to you, the devotion, the trust? You betrayed me in ways I can't even fathom." The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the destruction of their family, the trust they had built, and the future they had planned together. She had made him question everything: his love, his identity, even his role as a father. "You're not the woman I married," he said finally, his voice shaking with raw emotion. "You're not the mother of my children. You're someone else, someone I don't even recognize anymore." The anger in his voice had faded, leaving only a deep, aching sadness. He had loved her deeply and completely, but she had shattered that love with her lies. He knew now that he could never look at her the same way again, could never feel the same about the family they had once shared. Rebecca slowly stood, wiping her tears as she hesitantly took a step toward him. "No," James said firmly, shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore. I can't live in this house, in this life. You've taken everything from me, and I don't even know if I can ever forgive you." Rebecca reached out, but James stepped back, recoiling from her touch as if it were foreign, unrecognizable. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, the finality of his words echoing in the stillness. "I can't stay here. I can't stay with you." Rebecca's face crumpled as if the last shred of hope had been torn away. Her eyes pleaded silently, but James's decision had been made. The door to their life together was closing, and nothing she could say would change that. As he turned away, James felt the weight of the years he had spent building a family with Rebecca fall away like a crumbling facade. His footsteps echoed loudly in the still room as he walked toward the door. When it clicked shut behind him, it felt like a punctuation mark, a definitive end to the chapter of his life that had been built on lies. The house no longer held meaning for him, nor did the life he was leaving behind. In walking away, James wasn't just leaving Rebecca. He was leaving the lie they had lived, stepping into the unknown. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but there was something else now, a sense of liberation. The truth had ripped his world apart, but in its wake it had given him something unexpected, the chance to take back control of his life. As he moved forward, James felt the weight of betrayal begin to lift, replaced by a determination to reclaim his narrative. He would no longer live as a victim of Rebecca's choices. He would expose the truth, rebuild his life, and create a future free from the shadows of the past. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of his transformation.